Um, yeah, uh, it's also really exciting because, welcome everybody to the Smooth Brain Society. Today we have lecturer from Napier University, Dr. Faye Skelton. So welcome, Faye.
Thank you for having me.
And we also have, as a co-host today, Melanie Artemis, who's a PhD student at Victoria University. I'll let her give her a little bit of background on herself before we introduce our guest.
Oh, okay. My name is Melanie, and I'm a PhD student at Victoria University of Wellington in New Zealand, Aotearoa. I'm originally from the States, and I'm studying broadly moral judgment across cultures. I'm working with Dr. Rita McNamara. And yeah, I don't know if I already said I'm in my second year of uni. So, yeah, data collecting, which is exciting. Thanks for having me.
Awesome. This is really good because Faye is here to talk about memory. So memory in a forensic context. Talk about miscarriages of justice mainly, and her work on police facial composites. Is that what it is? That's what it's called, right? Police facial. So this is really cool because we had Marina Wimmer on a couple episodes ago who spoke about perception and false memories, and then we had Tirta Susilo on who spoke about face blindness and perception. So we're kind of working our way through the cognition and face perception kind of pipeline of Say with Faye. So welcome, Faye. Thank you for coming. And we will start where we start with everyone, with all our guests, which is if you could give us a little bit of background of how you got into your field of work. So just a little background on yourself.
Sure, yeah. So it's kind of a bit convoluted. I did my PhD in face recognition, actually, so at Lancaster University. And that was in kind of the development of face recognition in primary school age children, so kind of between the ages of about 4 to 11 years. And I really enjoyed that. I'd not particularly enjoyed cognitive psychology or developmental psychology as an undergraduate, and then went on to do a PhD in cognitive development. And went and got my first lectureship at the University of Central Lancashire in 2004. And it was kind of a really big department. There were kind of over 40 staff, and I was just doing a lot of tutorials and a lot of statistics workshops and like lots of marking because they had classes of like up to 350 students, and I was desperate to do a lecture. And my one of my tutors said, "Oh, I've actually got a lecture on false confessions. Would you like to take that? It's just a first year lecture." And I was like, "Oh, false confessions. I'd never really heard of them." And that was kind of how I initially got interested in miscarriages of justice. So it was just a very short kind of 2-hour lecture, and we touched on cases like the Birmingham 6 and the Guildford 4, which are kind of really notorious cases from the UK in the 1970s. And that was that's where my interest in miscarriages of justice started generally. A couple of years after that, a colleague, Professor Charlie Froud, he's at the University of Central Lancashire, he joined, and he was doing some work into police facial composites. And that really gave me an opportunity to get involved in face research again, kind of after my PhD. It was really difficult to get into primary schools and to continue kind of that PhD research in schools. And so I shifted focus onto police facial composites. So really looking at how we get the best images from witnesses and that kind of thing. How we get the best memories from witnesses, how the software can be improved to get really good images that don't waste police time and might actually have half a chance of identifying the offender. And then more lectures became available in forensic psychology. So I started getting offered lectures as people kind of moved jobs and stuff. I started getting offered lectures in eyewitness testimony police lineups. And I started supervising undergraduate and master's dissertations in those areas. And so I then became kind of generally interested in memory applied to a forensic setting. So memory for faces in a forensic setting, but kind of general memory in a forensic setting. Including kind of false memories, which, as you say, my colleague Marina touched on a couple of weeks ago. And then when I moved to Napier 9 years ago, I was involved in setting up the masters. So I do kind of a lot of work on kind of police facial composites, eyewitness memory, jury decision making. These are the sorts of things that I teach. So kind of forensic stuff. And then I was fortunate enough to win a grant to delve into miscarriages of justice. So actually interviewing people who have been wrongfully convicted and imprisoned, working with a charity based over in Glasgow. So it's kind of, it's not a neat line. I've taken in a lot of areas over the years, but I would say I've always had that key focus on evidence, accuracy of evidence, usefulness of evidence, how that can kind of help the police, how we can support the police to get good evidence from witnesses, and how we can try and avoid innocent people from being convicted of crimes they haven't committed, and then latterly kind of their experiences of that wrongful conviction. So yeah, not a neat story or a short story, but it's been an interesting one for sure.
No, that's really interesting. Can we start then with you said memory in a forensic context. So I know we spoke in detail about false memories in another podcast, but could you give people a little bit of a background of how our memory works and why we kind of see false memories and how this affects people in a forensic context or in a criminal context?
Absolutely. So memory has lots of roles in a forensic context. So if you witness a crime being committed, for example, you may know that a crime is being committed. It may be really obvious, or you may not know at the time that a crime is being committed, and you may only realise later on that you've witnessed something that you may now have some useful information for the police. And I think there can be a difference between what we might call intentional encoding, so knowing you have to pay attention to something because you're seeing something very important, and incidental encoding, so just going about your daily life and then realising later on, oh, actually that was really important. So a lot of research, participants in studies will know that they need to remember something for later on, but in real life, that's not the case. You won't necessarily always know that. But even so, memory isn't a camera or a video recorder, it's reconstructive. And so each time you recall an event, and by recall, I mean you're not responding to any particular cue, you're just trying to dredge up what you remember. Each time you recall an event, the account will differ, perhaps subtly. So you may forget details over time that perhaps don't seem important, or you may come to incorporate detail over time. So say, for example, there's something happens in an event that you don't quite understand and you can't fit it into a narrative of how that event might have played out. You may come to forget that detail because you can't logically fit it into a story. Or you may encounter details from other witnesses that you've spoken to, or from media reports, or you may actually just generate other details because they help you to explain some kind of gap in your account. So over time, we find that some details may be forgotten, some details may be incorporated, some things might be emphasised, others might be de-emphasised. But in essence, yeah, every time you recall something, it's a different instance, and that memory will be different from the previous time, even if you don't realise it. And that's not because anyone's trying to do anything wrong. It's just because that's how memory works. It is reconstructive, and we recall things in chronological order. We recall things as stories because that's how we best remember them. That that's how it makes sense to us. It needs to make a coherent whole. And over time, people's memories change as well. As I say, you incorporate new bits of details, you forget things. And so really well-meaning eyewitnesses, their accounts may change over time. They may come to include other witnesses' detail. They may come to change descriptions of perpetrators. They may come to add details which they didn't actually encounter at the time. And that is a false memory. If you include something as part of your account that you didn't actually see, that's a false memory. You may think you remember it, but you've just misattributed it to the source. You've attributed it to your memory rather than to coming from another witness. So yeah, that's it's just an established fact that our memories are very fallible. I mean, they can be absolutely amazing. They can be amazing, but they can be fallible. And even when we know that we have to pay attention, this situation's really important, we need to remember this detail, and we try and rehearse the detail, it's still fallible. But also our memory for unfamiliar people isn't great. So witnesses may know that they're witnessing a crime, and they may be looking at the perpetrator and they might think, I need to look really carefully at this person. I need to remember everything about their face because I'm going to need to give a description to the police. I might need to take part in a police lineup, so pick the person out of an identity parade or a video identity parade. And even then, we know that we don't necessarily remember the characteristics of faces that distinguish them from other faces. So in terms of face processing, if you think about how you would describe a face, you might describe whether the face is a male or female face, whether they have facial hair, what the hairstyle is, skin colour, eye colour, hair colour, any distinctive features. But realistically, the sorts of descriptions we give about faces will apply to probably tens of thousands of faces. And what's actually really important for face recognition is the distances between the features. So subtle changes in distances between the eyes, for example, can really impact face recognition. But that's not something we ever verbalise. It's not something we're very good at verbalising. It's not something we're used to doing. And so our descriptions of faces typically aren't great. Particularly faces we've maybe only seen once. We may have seen them from quite a distance. We may only have seen them for, a few seconds. And we know as well that we have group biases. So the most famous of these is the own race bias, whereby we are particularly poor at distinguishing between faces of other races and ethnicities to our own. And there are different reasons for this. It may be kind of an inattentional bias because we tend to group what we think of as out-group members together, but we individuate members of our own in-group. And we do see actually that people who have a lot of quality contact with a range of people from different ethnicities show a lower bias, as in they're much better able to distinguish between different people of a different ethnicity to themselves or different race to themselves. And there's a really famous case in the United States of Ronald Cotton and Jennifer Thompson. Jennifer Thompson was at home one night and she was, a man broke into her house and he attacked her, and she was in bed and it was dark and she was staring at this man saying, thinking to herself, I need to remember him. If I survive this encounter, I'm going to make sure that he goes to prison for what he's done to me. And she did survive the encounter and she went to the police and, she was absolutely certain that she gave him a good description. She picked a guy out of a lineup and, was given feedback. Oh, that's, great. You've done really well. And I think later on down the line, she then took part in another lineup and she picked the same person. And the police said, "Oh, that's great. You picked the same person you picked last time." So by now, she's absolutely convinced that she's picked the right man. And in fact, she picked the wrong man. And Ronald Cotton went to prison for about 11 years. And while he was in prison, the real offender was heard bragging in prison about what he'd done and what he got away with. And it's a really interesting story. Ronald Cotton was eventually exonerated. And he and Jennifer Thompson actually then travelled around the United States to colleges and universities telling people about their story and what had happened. And she was a really well-meaning eyewitness. But what had happened was Ronald Cotton was a black man, she was a white woman. We know that these are cases that are particularly poor for wrongful convictions. So African-American men in the States are much more likely to be wrongfully convicted, particularly if the witness is white. And she'd made an innocent mistake. She was absolutely convinced. Ronald Cotton actually does look very similar to the real offender, Bobby Poole. And she had that memory of Ronald Cotton in her mind. And she then had that memory qualified by police officers who said, "You picked the same person." "Well, what do you think?" "Well, I picked the right person twice." She then went to court and was, 100% certain that she'd picked the right person, because she'd picked the same person twice, and then her confidence in that identification had been inflated. And so we know that witnesses do that as well. Witnesses' memory in their accounts and witnesses' confidence in their memory, both for events and for people, is inflated if they get external feedback that support their identification or their account. Now, that might be from another witness, it may be from a police officer, maybe from a media report. But a confident but mistaken eyewitness is still really compelling to a jury. And they may persuade the jury that they are absolutely, 100% certain. And they may be 100% certain, but they can be very inaccurate. And we know that mistaken eyewitnesses are involved in, I think the US Innocence Project statistics have it at around 75% of cases, 75% of miscarriages of justice that they have been involved in involve a mistaken eyewitness. There may be other factors as well, but a mistaken eyewitness is involved in the vast majority of cases. And these are just well-meaning people that are trying to help the police to solve a crime. There's nothing untoward or sinister about their motivations.
Wow. That's a very high number, which I would have thought if 75% of miscarriages of justice are due to false eyewitness testimony. In that case, do you think there's an issue with eyewitness testimony itself then, or do you think it is still useful?
I think it is still useful, definitely, but I think eyewitness testimony alone is problematic for relying on, and I realise this is, it's a contentious issue, because there are cases where there will not be any other kind of evidence. There will only be the say-so of an eyewitness, and I do understand that it's very difficult. But I think if you've only got an eyewitness account and there's no corroboration for that eyewitness account, then I don't think that should carry sufficient weight for a conviction, because people can very easily be mistaken, but very confident that they're accurate. We know that people remember things falsely. And eyewitnesses they're a different kind of evidence, aren't they? Because with things like DNA and I'll not go into other kinds of forensic evidence, but kind of fingerprints and other things, we can test the sort of error rate. We can test the value of that evidence. We can test how accurate it is. And with people, we're not able to do that. We don't have diagnostic tests of how accurate is this person likely to be. We don't put witnesses to the test before we allow them to provide evidence, and we can't do that. So eyewitness testimony is a different kind of evidence. It cannot be rigorously tested, really, like other forms of evidence can. And I think that does make it a little ropier to rely on. And we know as well that, some people do make allegations. It is a minority, but some people do make allegations of things that have in fact not happened. And whether that's due to a false memory or whether it's due to, a more sinister motivation, I think it's very tricky to rely solely on eyewitness testimony, definitely. And I appreciate that means some perpetrators would go unpunished.
You said you're doing interviews now with people who have been wrongfully convicted. Are you seeing unreliable witnesses as kind of a pattern in these convictions? And are the people that are convicted, are they aware of that reason for the miscarriage of justice?
So the cases I've looked at so far, and it's just a handful of interviews. It's quite a difficult population to reach. And in fact, the lockdown conditions have had a really significant impact on people that have been wrongfully imprisoned. And many of them have, are continuing to suffer the ill effects of those lockdown conditions. The people that I've spoken to, I mean, some of the cases go back to the 1970s. I've not encountered a mistaken eyewitness yet in the cases that I've personally spoken to people about. What I have uncovered is, or what people do talk about, is the police wrongfully pointing the finger at them for some reason, and it may be because they've had because they've got a police record for something similar, and they're kind of known as a bit of a troublemaker, and so it's been pinned on them. There are a couple of cases where there is more, there are much more serious allegations of police misconduct. The police knowing that that they're essentially going to convict the wrong people, but doing that anyway. And there are cases where co-accused have been pressured into providing statements that incriminate themselves, so providing false confessions or incriminating statements. In at least a couple of the cases, no crime was actually committed. So the allegations have been, they're unfounded. There's no evidence that a crime was ever committed. So yeah, but there are. I don't think it's a representative sample overall. It's just, who I've been put into contact with from the Miscarriage of Justice organisation, who I'm working with over in Glasgow. So they've been recruiting from their client base. So they've been kind of working out who would be appropriate to be interviewed, and trying to get a span of cases across the years, different kinds of crimes. So we've got kind of terrorist offences, sexual offences, financial offences. But it's a very small number, so it's not reflective of kind of Innocence Project statistics. I think if I was to carry on interviewing for a long time, that may be the case, but as I say, it's just such a difficult population to reach, and these are people whose entire lives have been ruined, because a lot of people that are wrongfully convicted, they will appeal their sentences, or they'll appeal their conviction, but the appeal doesn't work. We have a couple of organisations in the UK, so the Criminal Case Review Commission and the Scottish Criminal Case Review Commission, and they review cases to go to the Court of Appeal. But they actually don't refer a lot of cases. They only refer a very small proportion of cases. They want to be certain that the case has some chance of succeeding before they refer it to the Court of Appeal. And essentially that means that the convicted person and their legal team need to have uncovered some new evidence that wasn't available, or they perhaps need to demonstrate that there was something wrong with the process, that there was a sort of procedural injustice. And this is quite a high burden of proof for somebody that's in prison. And the odds are stacked against them. So we say, you're innocent until proven guilty, and, it's guilty beyond reasonable doubt. But then when the person wants to appeal, they essentially have to find evidence that they are innocent. And that's really difficult to do, especially when requests for evidence may be refused. So people may not be furnished with evidence that may, in fact, support their innocence. So the vast majority of people, in fact, serve their sentence and come out of prison, and they've perhaps done a long prison sentence, so they've got all the other ill effects of being in prison for a long time. But they also have this mistrust of authority, this anger. Their entire lives are ruined because they will suffer the same consequences as if you're like a rightfully convicted person. They will find it difficult to find employment. They will find that their peer group has kind of moved on with their lives. They will find it difficult to reintegrate because they've missed out on such a long period of being free. Their families may have deteriorated. They may have completely lost relationships with their children over that time. People may not trust them. Their families might have been ostracised. They may have had to move around. And those kinds of practical consequences, if you like, the economic, the personal relationships, the social consequences, they will never recover from those. Their lives, they never get any of that back. And even if they are one of a tiny proportion of people that actually get compensated, if they're exonerated, a tiny proportion of exonerated people will get some compensation. That never can make up for what they've actually lost. And it's those broader impacts. It's not just the person, but it's their loved ones as well. It's their families, it's their children. I've spoken to people who are traumatized still, significantly traumatized, as in they can't sleep. They wake up having nightmares, screaming, reliving their encounter. They find it difficult to have relationships with members of their family because they've been away for so long. They're not able to kind of reintegrate into society because, it's just such a difficult thing to do. And, there is so little support for people that have been wrongfully convicted in terms of specialist psychological support to help them address the issues unique to wrongful conviction. So that lack of trust, that anger, that the change in identity. Essentially, you're being treated like you're a criminal. You're treated as though you're guilty of the crime you've been convicted of, but that's not actually who you are. And that's very difficult for people to come to terms with. So Mojo in Glasgow, the Miscarriage of Justice organisation, is one of the few organisations that really support victims of miscarriage of justice with the practical things like coming out of prison and getting any benefits you're entitled to and resettling, but also kind of psychological support. They have a pro bono, I think, clinical psychologist or a psychiatrist that provides psychological support for people that's specific to the miscarriage of justice element, that is unique to them. So it's, it's a massive issue. And one of the problems is people don't really think it still happens. The famous cases of the Birmingham Six and other cases in the 1970s, they're really well established. And as a result of those, we know that there was police wrongdoing. We know that statements were fabricated. We know that people were pressured into providing false confessions. But no one has been held to account for that. None of the authorities have been held to account for that. But people knew something was up. And as a result, the Police and Criminal Evidence Act in the 1980s came in, and there now has to be kind of recording of interviews. So-called third-degree techniques, i.e. beating people and, preventing them from sleeping and starving, those things are not allowed anymore. And I think the public find it really hard to realise that people can be pressured in other ways to falsely confessing to something they haven't done. There may be other pressures. It doesn't need to be physical pressure or torture, but also that people may be wrongfully convicted just from a catalogue of errors, from bad handling of evidence, from police thinking they've got the right person and then kind of having tunnel vision, not pursuing other less likely lines of inquiry. Juries, again, can be biased. The prosecution may not hand over evidence to the defence that would be supportive of the defence's case. They're supposed to, but they may not do that. So there are a range of weaknesses in the system that make people vulnerable, and individual weaknesses or combinations of weaknesses mean that there are a lot of people in prison that didn't do what they're in prison for. And the most recent case in the UK is that of the post office submasters and submistresses, where thousands of people have been convicted of financial offences when in fact it was the software that they were using as part of their jobs that was to blame. And that's just been in the news really over the last couple of years. It's come to light that it was the software that was at fault, and these people hadn't stolen any money, but it had been pinned on them. Some of them served prison sentences, and some have since died. But it's a massive story in the UK at the moment.
Wow, I didn't know that. That's well, we're in New Zealand, so we didn't hear it.
There is a great podcast, actually, if you're interested in the post office scandal, and it's just called "Investigating the Post Office Scandal," and that's what I'm kind of listening to at the moment in my spare time. It's horrendous, really. It's horrendous what people have been subject to.
Can I ask, because you spoke about 2 cases which you know of when no crime was committed, but somehow people were wrongfully imprisoned. What leads to that? So if no crimes happened, how can you make a case for it to begin with? And then also, have you met any, or have you read of any people who are convicted of a crime who believe they've done it but they actually did not do it? So another type of false memory, I guess.
So the first question, without wanting to give details of the cases, one was a financial case where it was alleged that the person had been overcharging customers, and the person was kind of governed by a particular organisation. So they were a professional governed by a particular organisation, and they were accused of overcharging their customers, and they were accused of stealing money from their business, which did not happen. So that was one case, and the other case was a historical sexual offence, but it was established that the complainant had other motivations for making the allegations, which were known to the accused, and had been reported prior to the police and were reported during the investigation, but these were not investigated. So yeah, there are, and the Miscarriage of Justice organisation are as certain as they can possibly be that no crime was committed, because other facts in the case do not support that those crimes were committed, and there's evidence that there may have been other motivations for making those allegations. Your second question was regarding whether people may believe they've committed a crime but they actually haven't. I've not encountered that in my own research, but there are some quite well-known cases. The most famous one, I think, is the case of Paul Ingram in the United States. So this was a man who was accused of sexual offences by his daughters, and his daughters went on to provide testimony and to make allegations that he had also abused other children and that they had all killed a number of infants in satanic rituals. And this was in the time of like the satanic panic in the 1990s. And Paul Ingram was persuaded by his church minister that Satan may have in fact wiped his memory, that this was a possibility, that he may have committed the crimes and he may just not remember them. And what happened in this case is, it's really bad practice. So Paul Ingram was interviewed many, many times over several months by the police, but he was also hypnotised to try and uncover memories that he might have repressed because they were too traumatic. Now we know that under hypnosis, false details may be implanted that people may come to believe are real. And so hypnosis as a method of interviewing is an absolute no-no. But what probably happened in Paul's case was, over a period of months, these details were implanted and he was kind of forced to consider how he might have committed the crimes. Now, we know that when people imagine they've done things, it becomes more real to them. And if you imagine repeatedly, or on a number of occasions, the events become more familiar and they become more real, and you become less certain that they haven't happened. And that's what happened with Paul Ingram. Over a period of time, he became unconvinced that he hadn't committed the crime, and that is the crimes, and that's the most important thing. Once you doubt your own certainty in your memory, that paves the way for false memories to be created or implanted. And so Paul Ingram did come to confess to the crimes that he was accused of. And then after he provided that confession and he kind of got out of that situation of being repeatedly interviewed, he said, actually I didn't do this. And there was no evidence. So there was no evidence that he had kind of tortured and killed babies and buried them. There was nothing to corroborate his daughter's accounts. But actually, once you provided a confession, it's very difficult to retract that, because everybody goes, well, why would you confess to something that horrendous if you'd not done it? You would never do that, right? 90% of people think they could never be persuaded to make a confession to something they haven't done. And so we don't think that other people do it. And Paul tried to retract his confession, but he was imprisoned. He was imprisoned for those crimes. And he served quite a long sentence. I can't remember how long, but he did serve quite a long sentence for those crimes that there was never any corroborating evidence for. So yes, absolutely. People can be persuaded through police interviews. They may be asked to imagine how they might have committed the crime if they had done it. Or they may be told by the police, like, we know that you're We know that you're wrong. We know that you're lying to us. Try again. Try a different version of events, because you're not getting out of here until we agree on something. And there is still very bad interview practice around the world. A lot of things have changed. But for example, in a lot of the United States, the police are still allowed to lie about evidence. So they're allowed to tell suspects that they have evidence on them that they in fact don't have. And research has shown that if somebody thinks there is evidence against them, they're much more likely to confess to something they haven't done, because they think they're going to be convicted anyway. And they may be told, actually, the judge and the jury will be very lenient on you if you confess, because you will at least have acknowledged that you've done something wrong. You might get a lighter sentence. And so for some people, making a false confession seems like the best way out of a situation. People might make false guilty pleas because it may be a minor charge. They may have essentially already served the time on remand, and think, well, if I admit it, I get to walk free. Whereas if I deny it, I may actually be subject to more prison time. So people can be persuaded even by their legal counsel that pleading guilty is the best thing for them to do in that situation. So there's lots of interacting factors. And we know that some people also are more vulnerable. So people who have less confidence in their memories, or people who are more susceptible to influence from authority, people who are more compliant and just kind of go along with a situation to avoid causing trouble, people who have perhaps intellectual disabilities, children and vulnerable adults, may be more susceptible to making false statements as well. Yeah.
So in some of my research, I've looked at a lot of social justice things, and I'm also in this cross-cultural space. So I'm kind of wondering why we hear so much about the American justice system and how it, I guess, a perspective, I have an American perspective, so I can only speak on that. But from an outside of America perspective, what is that? What's unique about the United States that's typically reported or compared to with other cultures?
So what are the factors that we most notice, or why do we notice them?
Yeah, or why is there an overrepresentation of the United States justice system in the literature? Is that true?
Yeah.
First of all, and is it? Why do you think that is?
Well, a lot of it is down to what published literature is available. So we know that there is a huge Western bias in journal articles being published. So Europe and the United States have got the research culture. We have most of the journals. We have the funding for research, and white Western scholars are overrepresented in the literature. It's very unusual to see research from other parts of the world. It's much more it's much less common to see that. All of the big conferences are in the States and Europe, really. Certainly kind of memory conferences and forensic conferences. But I think also the media has a big part to play, because people are, the United States have a lot of kind of crime dramas, and a lot of documentaries. They mostly come from the States and from the UK, I guess. Or certainly what I see on Netflix and other platforms comes from the States, and it comes from the UK. And so that's where that's what students are familiar with. That's what students then want to go on and research, and that's how we get, more and more and more scholars in Europe and in the States kind of going into these areas, which just reinforces the fact that that's where the majority of the work is. I think that's a massive factor, definitely. The big journals really are the majority would be from the States, I think. And it's a huge place, and there's so much great work is going on there that's what we see.
Yeah, I was gonna say I haven't been to the US in ages, but I would have heard about the Central Park 5 or whatever, but I hadn't heard about the Birmingham 6, was it? Would you say
Birmingham
something?
6, yeah.
Yeah. So I don't know the background of one, but I know the background of the other just because of, I guess it's more prevalent in the media, more examples of anything come out from there. Yeah. Apart from it, do you think that there's a difference in the justice system itself, or across the Western countries, do you see probably the similar rates of miscarriages of justice, or is it more in certain countries versus others?
I think it's probably largely similar. We hear a lot more from the States, I think, because the US Innocence Project is kind of the most well-known innocence project. And that kind of started when DNA evidence became available, and we started being able to essentially rule people out of having committed crimes. So it's not been going for, it started within my lifetime. I feel a lot younger than I actually am. So I think the causes of wrongful convictions are probably similar across, certainly across Western cultures. In that, yes, there will be evidence of police wrongdoing. There will be poor management of evidence. There will be mistaken witnesses. There will be faults in kind of forensic procedures like lineups and so on. I think there are then kind of biases within systems that will be different. So in adversarial systems, like we have in the UK and you have in the US, where, the legal proceedings are about someone winning and someone losing. It's a competition. I think that's open to kind of sources of error that perhaps more inquisitorial systems aren't open to, as in, prosecution teams may not disclose evidence that they should share. People may be more, investigators may be more persuaded to use unreliable interviewing techniques in order to get the conviction. And I know in the, racial biases, for example, will be more exaggerated in some places than others. So the States, for example, I said about African American men will be overrepresented in the prison population. But the thing is, if an eyewitness is mistaken about the perpetrator, there are then systemic biases whereby people of colour may be more likely to be given a harsher sentence. They may be treated differently within the system. There are systemic biases that mean actually once they're in the system, they may be treated less fairly. They may be more likely to be convicted. They may get a harsher sentence. They may be less likely to be released on appeal. And so it's a whole range of factors that kind of stack up against people.
You mentioned adversarial versus more inquisitive judiciary systems. Are you referring to like the one in France where it's very different? You don't actually have a jury kind of thing, do you? Or the jury is made of judges or something like that. I'm not completely sure, but I know some places have different systems.
Yeah, absolutely. So in inquisitorial systems, the kind of the judge is more in charge of the kind of the fact finding rather than arbitrating between the defence and the prosecution. So it's a different setup altogether, and absolutely it's not a perfect setup. But the legal proceedings don't really become about kind of winning and losing. I'm absolutely not an expert in different legal systems, but I think there are key differences there that the different sides in adversarial systems, they want to win. And although investigations should be about fact finding, sometimes it's not about fact finding. It's about getting a conviction. It's about winning, and that can definitely influence the way that that legal proceedings go, I would say.
So we get this can this allows us to move nicely into your work on how to fix it a little bit, because you said you work with police facial composites.
Mm-hmm.
So could you explain what that is? And and we can go from there.
Yeah, absolutely. So police facial composites are the images that are created from a witness's memory that would then be circulated via the media to try and get names suggested to the police of who the offender might be. So in the UK, I always remember growing up, we still have a program called Crime Watch, and you would get these images circulated that say, kind of, have you seen this person? This is a composite created with the witness. And they can be done in a variety of ways. So there are less so now, I think, but there may be forensic artists that can work with a witness and sketch out what the face looks like. In the 1970s, there were kind of what we call manual systems that would have, they were almost like a jigsaw, so like a wooden template, and you would have numerous different rectangles that would have different eyes printed on them, and the witness would look through the eyes that were available and pick the eyes that matched the face that they remember, and an image is pieced together that way. What we have now is computer software systems that allow the police to work with witnesses to develop an image. And these look much more realistic because digitally they can be enhanced and features can be blended together. And so they can actually look much more like faces rather than jigsaws. Or, I was just saying earlier as well, what's really important is that the distances between the features are correct. That's a big, if that looks wrong, people may not recognise an image as being of somebody that they know, or they may not think it resembles somebody they know if the distances are wrong. So a big advantage of these digital systems now is that you can move the features around, so you can change the distance between the eyes, or change the length of the nose, or the distance between the eyebrows and the hairline, for example. And we know that has quite a significant impact on how well the image is recognised. But what a lot of that work has involved is working out how best to interview witnesses to get a good description. So if you ask witnesses to recall a face, what did the face look like? They will recall features. The hair was blonde, it was curly, it was short, they had a moustache, blue eyes, the face was quite thin. And you go, okay, well, we can try and generate an image of someone with those features, but how do you start to narrow down from the population? It can resemble many people. So the aim of circulating the images through kind of Crime Watch or through newspapers would be, this person lives in this area and they've robbed this shop. Does it look like someone you know? Can you suggest a name? But quite often the images would be very poor. There are a number of really bad examples that you can just find online. But research showed that actually if a witness was interviewed, say 3 or 4 hours after they'd seen the face, the resulting image might only be named accurately 3 or 4 times out of 100. And this has been established with lab research. So we get someone into the lab, we show them a face of somebody they don't know. 4 hours later, they come back, and an experienced software operator builds the composite with the witness. They off the witness's description, they'll select the eyes and the nose and the mouth and the hair, and they'll move the distances around and check that the witness is happy with the image. But at kind of 3-4% naming, it's pretty poor, really. And actually, witnesses are very infrequently interviewed that quickly. It may actually be a couple of days. And the police are under enormous pressure, right? They've got lots of leads to follow up. And so they can't necessarily get round to interview somebody and create a composite with them within a few hours. And so a couple of days delay is more usual. And so performance will be even lower, maybe a couple of percent. So what a lot of the work has done is go, okay, what can we do to help witnesses make better images? And one of the key developments has actually been changing the way that the images are put together. So rather than the witness kind of choosing the eyes, the nose, the mouth and the ears and the hair and so on and fitting them together bit by bit, what research in face recognition shows us is that actually if we're like, when we remember faces, we don't tend to remember individual features that well. We remember the face as a whole. Yes, with some idea of what the features look like, but we remember the face. And we don't necessarily have very good memory for individual features of the face. And so that research drove Professor Charlie Froude's PhD, and he essentially led the development of a new system, which rather than the witness picking features individually, they look at screens of whole faces and then they will pick a couple of faces that most resemble the perpetrator. And then using mathematical algorithms, the faces that they've chosen are blended together. And it's what we call like an evolutionary system. All those kind of mathematical descriptors are blended, and then there will be like a new generation of faces, and they will then pick from those faces. And eventually they will kind of evolve an image, which they can then change the shape of the eyes. They can change colouring of the features, but they can also say, for example, the face looked much more mean than that. So the system has what are called holistic tools, which allow whole changes to be applied to the face. So the face can be made to look more dominant, more masculine, more threatening, or more honest. And those actually help change the whole face. So the witness can kind of use this sliding scale and go, actually, that looks more like my memory. That looks more like my memory. And that is actually proving to be incredibly successful with witnesses. And where I fit into this story is I've been involved in research looking at how we can best interview witnesses to get the best image, whether they're using one of the older kind of piece-by-piece systems or one of the newer evolutionary systems. And we know that actually the system that you use with the witness influences how you can best interview them. So actually, if they're selecting feature by feature, it's good for the witness to have recalled the features because they're going to need to select them. But we know that it's good for the witness then to think about the character of the face because they need to remember the whole face and how it all fits together. Using the newer systems where features aren't selected, it's not necessarily advantageous for a witness to remember the individual features. So they might give a description of the face, but we don't need that description. We're not relying on it to pick features. And what's become apparent with this newer system is that if the witness focuses mostly on the eye region while they're selecting these whole faces, that's an advantage. And so we've established as well that actually, if you can get the witness to think about the character of the face, but particularly thinking about the eye region, that is then beneficial for the resulting composite. So it's about aligning the cognitive processes involved in memory, in remembering the face, aligning that with the cognitive processes involved in constructing the face. So slightly different techniques would be used for the different systems, because the cognitive operations the witness will use to help build the face are slightly different between the two systems. And that aligns with research in the 1970s that shows actually if the situation you're in when you encode the face or you encode the event, the closer that is to the situation you're in when you recall the event or retrieve the event or the face, the closer those are aligned, the better the memory will be. And that's one of the key principles of the cognitive interview that's used with witnesses. Mentally reinstating the context in which you encoded the event or encoded the face helps to retrieve a better quality memory, because those two kind of contexts are aligned.
I'm wondering why the eye region is so impactful. Is it because the memory is better with the eye region, or is it, like cognitively? Can you explain that a little bit?
It's a really good question. So, with faces that we are familiar with, so people that we know, we're used to looking at their eyes because we make eye contact while we're speaking, or most of us make eye contact while we're speaking. But we also get a lot of information about emotion and mental state from the eyes. So we're very good at recognizing eye regions of people that we're familiar with. And, that's because that's where we pay attention to. So there's a distinction between what we call the internal features of the face, like the eyes, eyebrows, nose and mouth, and the external features like the face shape, the ears and the hair. Now, what we find we do with unfamiliar faces is we're really good at remembering like the hairstyle, the general face shape. And although we can remember the internal features of the face, the external features are kind of equally as salient in our memory. But of course, external features are easy to change. We might wear disguises, we might have haircuts, we might grow facial hair or shave facial hair off, and that can dramatically alter appearance. So what we need witnesses to do when they're remembering faces is focus on the internal features, because somebody who knows the perpetrator will remember the internal features. They'll have a more stable representation for the internal parts of the face than they will for the external parts of the face. So focusing on the character of the face shifts attention to these internal features, because that's where we get kind of expression and character and stuff from. And focusing their attention specifically to the eye region is beneficial, because if that's accurate, we know that can drive recognition for people that are familiar with the face. So it's about trying to align what the witness remembers with how people familiar with the identity will recognise them. Perhaps didn't explain that very clearly, but it's about trying to align the witness memory with what a familiar person will remember.
So, is this technique being used in practice, or is this still kind of more in the developmental stages?
It's being used in practice. So there are a couple of these holistic evolutionary facial composite systems in use. Certainly across the UK, but also in different places around the world. It's not worldwide yet, but it is being picked up. And yes, so my collaborator Charlie Froud does a lot of work with police forces in training them essentially on the latest research developments that will help them to get better images from witnesses. And so the particular system that I've worked with, which is EvoFit, Charlie and his team will meet with police officers from different police forces reasonably regularly, just to update them on, actually, this is the research that we've done. This is what we've found. Is this something you can kind of integrate into your practice? How do you think this might work in reality? So what would usually happen is we'd get, a few police forces to perhaps trial it, and then we'd look at the results from the police trials and see whether they'd actually noticed a real difference. Because obviously sometimes there are things that we do in research that in reality they just don't work for some reason. Maybe they're very time consuming, or the police or witnesses don't necessarily understand why they're doing it. So we've got to make sure that there is that integration between research and practice. But yeah, absolutely. If something's working in research, it would be shared with the practitioners, with the relevant practitioners, and it would be hoped that over time that would become kind of embedded in procedures when you're using that particular system.
Nice. And how willing are police officers in, what do you say, taking new systems on board? Have you noticed any resistance or whatever to those things? I feel it's very hard to train. My mom, who's a geneticist, says it's very hard to train medical practitioners to use new things. So is it kind of the same? If you're trained in doing some old technique, is it very hard to get them to use new techniques, even if they are available?
So my own experience, so when I was at the University of Central Lancashire, I did actually, I was actually involved in training, and actually the officers that you get along to training are really keen. They want to learn about the new technique. If it's going to help them to catch more offenders, it's going to help them to catch the right offenders. They're really keen to do that. I think what the pressure is that police forces don't necessarily have the money floating around for new versions of software. And of course, police are under enormous pressure. Their numbers have been reduced by UK governments, and they're expected to do more and more all the time with less and less resource, both personnel and financial. And so I don't think, where things are difficult to roll out or it's difficult to gain traction, it's absolutely not because of unwillingness to learn. It's because of financial constraints, perhaps in adopting a new system and updating everything and getting all the relevant staff trained on the new system. So what tends to happen is you would start with one force, because across most of the UK, forces are reasonably independent from each other. And so, when I was working at the University of Central Lancashire, we would get Greater Manchester Police, for example, would come and be trained. They were, quite eager to find out how the system worked and to use the system. And indeed, they did see some great success. But it just maybe other forces are under more pressure, or they've got, other projects going on at the time that are just taking precedence. And so it's a very slowly approach. But I wouldn't say that any officers I've met have been resistant. It's been about organisational kind of pressures, really, that have kind of prevented them from engaging as they might want to.
I think that's so interesting because I was reading, I think it's a pretty well-known book named Biased by Jennifer Eberhardt, and she studies implicit bias in the United States, and she does some trainings with police officers. And if I remember correctly, she has experienced resistance or just like non-interest in learning about how to kind of correct those implicit biases. I'm just thinking about how maybe that confrontation of your own perception might be different than being delivered like a tool that could do that instead. I don't have a question, that's just a thought.
I think that's really interesting, actually, because it's not my research, but there is quite a lot of research looking at biases within investigative processes. Mm-hmm. And actually, biases are to blame for miscarriages of justice. It may be a witness's faulty memory, but then there may be biases in the investigative process. So confirmation bias, the police may have a particular suspect in mind. There is some evidence that perhaps aligns with that suspect, and they may then disregard other evidence that doesn't align with that line of inquiry. We know that jurors are biased as well, but also we know that forensic scientists have biases. There's a decent body of research by Itil Draw showing that forensic experts are biased, but actually people don't believe they're biased. They think that because they're experts, they're able, and they know about the biases within their line of work, that they're able to overcome those biases. But in fact, they're not. So expertise is kind of a risk factor because people actually stop paying very close attention to areas of bias because they think, well, I'm aware of them, I can overcome them. But as with implicit bias, just being aware of something doesn't mean that we actually know how to address it. It takes really, sustained motivation and effort to overcome biases, and mostly we don't do that. So yeah, it absolutely is a factor, and I definitely don't have the answer for that. I think it's part of being human, isn't it? We're biased, we make mistakes, and people make genuine mistakes. But when those mistakes have such dire consequences, we have to start looking at the system and going, what can we do here to try and detect these sources of bias? What protocols and procedures can we put in to try and make sure that if there is bias, it doesn't just get perpetuated at every stage?
That's cool. So I will ask then, what are your future research plans, and how do you think we can improve our current systems, our justice systems? What are the things we can do immediately in terms of kind of helping to, reduce bias, and what kind of steps do we need to take to reduce miscarriages of justice?
So my kind of immediate plans are so tying up the project where I'm interviewing victims of miscarriage of justice. There's a couple more people I would hope to speak to there, but there's a real absence of literature on the broader impacts. And so what I would like to do next is speak to families and find out about the sorts of things that they've encountered, the sorts of consequences that they've encountered. Because the impacts are really far-reaching, and there's actually very little evidence. There's very little research looking at what people's experiences are. So we look at the causes of miscarriages of justice. There's lawyers and criminologists looking at what's wrong with the system, what needs to happen here and there, but not really looking at actually what has this person experienced. When did that experience start? When did they start to feel the impacts? What have those different impacts been? How has it changed their lives? And so, yeah, I would like to extend to speak to family members, definitely, because I think they're victims too, and they're very frequently ignored in all this. I think the biggest thing for me is that nothing will change until the system acknowledges that there is a problem. So, miscarriages of justice are not really talked about very frequently. And if they come up in conversation, people say, oh, we've got the Criminal Case Review Commission. They're reviewing cases. They're passing people onto the appeals court. And, if the appeals court overturns the conviction, then, everything's all right and that's fine. So the system's not broken. because we've got an appeals court and it quashes convictions or it overturns convictions, and then people might be exonerated, and there we go. And I don't think people realise how small a proportion of cases will ever get to the appeal court. And yes, there are people that will say, well, actually, there are false claims of innocence. But actually, I think false claims of innocence are a tiny minority. And really, for a case to proceed, for it to be taken on by lawyers, there needs to be good evidence that the person did, in fact, not commit the crime they've been convicted of. And in a tiny proportion, so it's a few percent of people will ever get to the Court of Appeal, and a few percent of them, well, actually, I think about 2/3 of them, if you get to the Court of Appeal, about 2/3 of them will actually have their conviction quashed there. So you've got fairly good odds if you get to the Court of Appeal, but the burden of proof is so high that you're not likely to get there, really. And it's also biased in terms of legal aid, so people are very limited in terms of what financial support they can get. And innocent people, even if they've got to the Court of Appeal, they've had their conviction quashed, they're now, officially not guilty. They may have spent their life savings, they may have remortgaged their house, they may be in debt for the rest of their lives from having to fight that. And that itself is a life sentence, if you're going to struggle for the rest of your life. And so there are lots of things that need to change. I know within the UK, they're now looking at the provision of legal aid and perhaps the threshold for where you might be able to access that. But the compensation scheme is woefully inadequate. If you are lucky enough to be awarded compensation, you may have money deducted for what they call saved living expenses for the time you were in prison. So all that time you were in prison, that you were innocent, in fact, of the crime you were said to have committed, you've not been paying rent and mortgage and living expenses, so they will take that from your compensation, which is utterly atrocious. And again, not a lot of people realise that that is the case. Most people will not be compensated because you have to meet very strict criteria for compensation. Solicitors taking on miscarriages of justice, it's legal aid work, it's very poorly paid. So a lot of solicitors, in fact, cannot afford to take the work on. So it's very difficult to access a legal team to support you. So there's so many things that are wrong. And actually what has to change is we have to acknowledge this is an issue. This is a thing that is happening. There are lots of people that are wrongfully convicted that are in prison for crimes they haven't committed. And we have to start with that acknowledgement of it is a problem, because until it's recognised by, the highest authorities that it is a problem, there can't be any change, realistically.
Go ahead.
That's a really good point to end on, I think, unless Mel has any other questions.
I just have one question because, first of all, I think your research sounds really valuable and the future direction sounds really important and exciting. And I think it's really brave to take on such systemic issues in your research, and that's something I definitely hope to do as well. So I just have a final question of how, when you're conducting these interviews and thinking about all these systemic issues, how do you kind of maintain that motivation in a positive way and not be fueled by anger or distrust in the system yourself? But yeah, how do you maintain your own inner peace when you do this kind of work?
It's a brilliant question, and the honest answer is it's quite challenging. You're listening to these accounts of how people's lives have been absolutely ruined, and it's some of those accounts are really upsetting. Some people that you speak to get upset. They're impacted every day by what has happened to them, and I think my motivation is I want people to know about these issues. I want the broader public to know that these issues are real, that many people are experiencing them. I want them to know about the things that are wrong with the system so that they're aware of it in case it could ever happen to them. People don't think it will ever happen to them, and then it does. So people need to be aware of of possible risks and shortcomings within the system. And I don't think I can do that being angry. So when I go out and do public engagement, I have to be balanced. I can't be an angry person, because that would impact me more broadly. And I have to have some faith that the work I'm doing might contribute in some way to making some change, and that by increasing awareness, I'm at least protecting people. I'm highlighting things that might happen to them that perhaps they didn't realise could happen to them. And just being kind of open and approachable and honest about these things, I think, is the best way to engage people in conversation. I would also add, the legal professionals I've met, the police officers, the lawyers, nobody I've met wants to send an innocent person to prison. So I also have to inherently believe that people working within the criminal justice system are doing their absolute best with the resources they have, and that mistakes will be made, and that they would be equally motivated to also make sure that those mistakes were minimised. And the people that I've met and have worked with are very much like that. And I know there will be bad apples, and there will be people that are more concerned with getting a conviction, or may have biases against a particular person. But I think the majority of people are good people who are trying to do their job as well as they can. And I think that's the mindset I have to go into these things with.
Thank you.
That's incredible. Thank you for that. I echo the same sentiments Melanie started off the statement/question with, and she said it more eloquently than me. So thank you so much for your work. And can't be easy. It definitely isn't easy. I'll move on. I think we can end there in terms of the discussion, but because the stuff is very heavy, and this is heavy for more than just pure research reasons, we like to end with a few kind of rapid fire questions, which are a lot chiller, a lot more fun, happier note to wind down with. So I've sent you 5 of the questions, and I'll ask the other 5, and we'll kind of go one by one and ask them to Faye, and after that we can end. So Faye, you okay with that?
Absolutely, yeah.
Does that sound good? Yeah. Because I also know the first time I met you were in the Napier Edinburgh cafeteria, and you were laughing and telling jokes about your driving.
It seems to be a theme. I've been telling jokes about my driving again this week.
So it's just probably this conversation so far has probably been on the polar opposite end of that.
Yeah, a little bit. It is pretty heavy, but yeah, worthwhile.
Yeah, exactly. Mm-hmm. Do you go first, Sahir?
All right, Mel, do you want to start?
Okay.
No, you can go first.
Okay, summer or winter?
Ooh, summer.
Movies or TV shows?
TV shows.
Cats
Movies
or dogs?
Are too short.
Oh, cats or dogs? Sorry.
Cats. Even though I'm wearing whippets in my ears, definitely cats.
Yeah, I was about to say those are cool earrings. All right. If you could have a superpower, what superpower would it be?
I would like to be able to teleport. Travel time really annoys me, so teleportation, yeah.
If you could live anywhere in the world, where would it be?
Oh.
Now that you have the teleportation power.
Yeah.
The teleportation power. That is it's a really tricky one. I've not been anywhere yet that I would choose over Scotland. I like visiting places, but I'm happier in Scotland than I've been anywhere else, I think. Yeah.
What's something stupid would someone's tricked you into believing or doing?
Okay, on a school trip when I was about 12, the teachers told us that the sheep that had red dots on them had been marked with red dots because they were angry sheep and we should ignore them. It has since become apparent that the teachers tricked all the school children on that trip every year with the same thing, but I went round for years thinking sheep with red dots on them were angry sheep that should be avoided.
That's a good one. If you were not doing this...
Now I'm rethinking what my...
Oh, sorry.
Sorry, I just wanted to say now I'm rethinking what my parents told me when I was a kid about bulls, because there used to be a lot of cows and stuff going around our house, and you'd see the occasional one with the nose ring, and they used to say that was because they get mad or they're pretty aggressive. So now I need to think about that again.
Actually, they might just be a bit punk.
Maybe.
Yeah, it's a thing. If you were not doing this, what would you be doing?
I always think that if I'd not done a psychology degree, I would like to have done forensic science. So, yeah, maybe working in forensic science.
So not that far removed from
Not that
what you're
far
doing.
removed, no.
Kind
And
of.
actually, as a child, I wanted to be a police officer, which, I mean, now I can't imagine ever being able to do that job. But yeah, not too far from where I am.
Nice. All right. So the final question then, if you could leave us with one piece of advice, our listeners, all of us, what would it be?
Okay. Something I've had to learn fairly recently for myself, but that resting is not a treat or being lazy. It would be make sure that rest and enjoyment are essential parts of your working week. Because if you don't do that, you become very poorly. So make sure you take time for yourself. It's not being indulgent or selfish.
That's great advice. Hey, Mel.
Yes. I need to hear that sometimes.
As PhD students, we need it.
Yeah.
Absolutely, because the boundaries are really blurred there, aren't they? You just kind of work whenever you can. It's I don't forget the feeling.
Well, awesome. Thank you so much for coming on. Really appreciate it.
It's been a pleasure.
I wanted to keep talking for ages, but I kept taking a look at the time because one, it's 10:30 p.m. here. Two, it's your work day and we've been recording for ages. So hopefully we can have you back and continue the discussions. I hope you enjoyed.
Yeah, I'd be happy to speak to you again, definitely.
Yeah,
exciting. Thanks, Mel, again for joining. I can't see your video at the moment, but
sorry. Thank you. Thanks
around.
for having me and answering my questions. My first podcast ever.
Thanks both, and I hope I haven't given you any nightmares. I hope you have something fun to read or watch before you settle down for your sleep.
No, it's inspiring.
Oh yeah, don't worry. Heaps of that.
Inspiring.
Yeah. Awesome. So thanks everyone for listening as well. If you guys are still here, but I don't see any reason why you wouldn't be. and thanks again, Faye and Mel. And everyone, take care until next time. Bye.
Thank you. Take care. Bye bye.